when I was on somebody else's podcast, we got into a discussion and asking if I could take all the steroids I wanted, but no side effects. So I'm just getting the muscular potential of the steroids, or I could I could be natural, but give myself elite level genetics. So in terms of muscle size, structure, whatever, I said, not even close. I would take the genetics because
it's cheaper too.
Yeah, even if cost wasn't a thing, it would just like, it's not even close because frankly, when we see the crazy genetic responses or the crazy responses to steroids, those are still, as you pointed out with like the scatter plots, Brandon, those are still the genetic freaks. Some people, if you have average, like just totally average genetics, your response to steroids are probably going to be pretty mediocre and you'll gain muscle. Don't get me wrong. They will do a lot for you, but there are people who just don't respond that well. And so by far, genetics are going to be a bigger factor there. And especially once you factor in muscle shape and insertion. I think I asked Abel yesterday because he's asked me before like height and measurements. And I asked him the length from his knee down to his foot. And I then measured mine. Now, Abel and I are the same height. And just that one thing, I had like 2.5 inches longer. So you're talking like just the bottom of your leg. And that's how our calves could measure similarly. Maybe his is like a 1/2 inch bigger, but most people would say he has great calves and I have horrible calves. And you're talking a 1/2 inch difference, but that just goes to insertions and shape. And that's one small factor when you get into genetics, right? So there's so much that would go into it. I would say genetics reign supreme by a long shot.
No, I agree completely. And the big thing about genetics, it's not only about what genetics you have, but it's also your perception about your genetics. So I often find myself speaking with clients about their psychology around things because we actually have clinical trials that look at the response to what people are told about their genetics in comparison to what their actual genetics are. So, for example, there is an obesity gene called the FTO gene, which is involved in hunger, satiety, and obesity. And they've done studies where they've tested subjects to determine their genome essentially, and to see if they have the good portion of this gene or the bad version of this gene. And then they've looked at things like hunger hormones and satiety hormones like ghrelin, GLP-1, and also like subjective metrics like self-reported fullness. And for most of the outcomes, regardless of what version of the genes they had, what mattered most was what they were told about their genes, both subjectively and objectively. So those who were told that they had a good version of the gene, regardless if they actually had the gene or not, reported greater feelings of fullness and had higher levels of GLP-1 and showed that their levels of satiety were both higher physiologically as well as psychologically, despite not even having that gene. So it's not only, we have to take into consideration, it's not only the genes, but it's also what you think about it. So if you have these self-limiting beliefs about your genes, and I've had guys that just think their genetics are shit. You know, they've been training 3 to 5 years. They read on these forums that within the first 3 to 5 years of natural training, you should be able to eke out 90% or whatever percentage someone wants to put on of their their natural muscular potential, but they haven't optimized everything. And it's this self-limiting mindset when you kind of like extrapolate that out and pull them back from it and make them realize, listen, you've done a lot of things suboptimally. You haven't milked everything out like one of us have. You know, you have so much more genetic potential. Once they start, discarding those self-limiting beliefs, they're able to, kind of milk and really get every ounce of their potential out. And honestly, most of us aren't doing genetic testing, and the genetic testing we do have isn't, reliable enough where any of us know our genetics. So we really need to focus on what's in our control, which is our actions, our behaviors, and our habits, and trying to get the best physique that each and every one of us can, and not worrying about the genetic freaks that we see on the internet. And I think that's the biggest issue with social media, is that there's this comparison thing, and that's, comparison is the thief of joy, essentially.
Oh yeah, for sure. And one thing I was actually thinking of making an Instagram post on this, but I don't, I'm hesitant to come across as somebody who's always trying to look at the negative side of it, but it's more just kind of like it's really what this is just a fact is, I've said many times before how we gravitate towards things that we're good at, right? So we see, like, if Doug Miller was on the opposite side of the genetic spectrum, you never would have heard of him, right? I mean, there's a reason that we hear about these guys. And something that I think people should realize is, if we assume that muscle mass potential follows a Gaussian curve like many human traits, right? then it's almost like a standard that people will say, okay, like your average natural bodybuilder, 5'9", 160 pounds on stage, right? That's kind of what we hear. That maybe like a Brad Loomis, even about Alberto Nunez, I think competes around 160, right? So let's say that's just like, and Alberto's actually better, but let's just say that 5'9", 160 is average. So then on the other extreme, we do very rarely see people who will compete at 5'9", 5'10", 185 natural, right? Even like Dice, and extremely impressive. If we see that and we acknowledge that they are still natural, then it is necessarily true that there's somebody out there who would then compete at 5'9", 135 pounds, right? If somebody is competing 25 pounds heavier than, let's say, a Brad Loomis, then again, if it follows this natural bell curve, then there is really somebody out there who would bust their ass for 20 years and step on stage at 5'9", 5'10", 140 pounds. Like that exists. You just don't see it because, frankly, nobody's going to do that for the most part because that they're going to look bad. They don't want to put in all that time into something that they're not good at. But that person does exist, and they could be doing just as good of a routine, just as good nutrition, and it could happen. So, this always goes back to like, following somebody who is knowledgeable. It can be hard to tell because when we say genetics reign supreme, that I would say genetics reign supreme over training and nutrition knowledge, over a lot of things, right? If you really have elite level genetics. So it's just to point out that those people do exist. Those are the people you'll never hear about. But I would say it's, again, almost necessarily true.
Yeah, it's we talked a lot before about what averages are and how would we rate our genetics. Like, are we just average, like you and I, Dave, let's say, or are we above average or below average? And like the longer I'm coaching people and the more people I work with, I think just a better picture I get of like, okay, like what is kind of out there among people who have been lifting for a couple of years. And for example, that strength standards video that I put out not long ago, and there I gave some standards of like, okay, if you hit this, that's pretty respectable. And a couple of years ago, I would have said that that's like laughably low. Like I said that if you can bench press, 80 kilos for most guys, that like kind of average-ish height, somewhere between say 5'9" and 6 foot, something like that. If you can bench press, 80 kilos for 5 reps, that's respectable. Like now we're talking, you're in the respectable zone at this point. I could bench press. I still would say that I don't have great genetics. I think I have okay genetics, but I could bench press that like probably midway through my first year of lifting or something like that. And I see tons of people that are not even close to that, and so I think we have a very skewed perception of what averages really are because we interact with a lot of people on Instagram and whatever. And so I got a general image of like, okay, like I would say that I have a roughly average physique because I see a lot of people who have been lifting for as long as I have, and most of them have similar levels of muscle mass. But man, like people on Instagram that are posting their pictures that are comfortable enough with their physique to actually post a picture, they're probably not truly average. Like in the grand scheme of things, they are probably already above average to some extent. So yeah, and that's why it's very hard for people to fathom that someone could be that impressive, partly. So
yeah, well, look at height, man. I mean, if there was like a height training gym, every basketball player would be a fake natty, and I mean, it's not the same because it's not you can't really change it for the most part. But I'm just saying when you look at how much humans vary in some other physical traits, I mean, it's amazing. So. I think, when it doesn't take a 4'5" individual out there and a 7'3". I mean, you can imagine the genetic variation in muscle mass. So,
yeah, if someone never lived or someone was born in the Netherlands or like Montenegro, let's say, like that's also a very tall country and never left that country, like let's say a century ago or something, they would think that the average height for males is like, 6'1". And right. The average female height is like, 5'7", 5'8". And then you go to like Asia or whatever, and like you see like, oh, wow, like height really differs, across the globe. So,